So here we go. um, so I really kind of ardently believe that you deserve to read a real book, which is why I assigned this textbook. And it's the textbook of the 3 or 4 that is I like the least, but it seems like it's the one that you like the most. And so we've kind of reached this compromise. But I think it's all of them are really good books, and it's a good book that if you if you were to go on to another university or something, your evolution class would definitely transfer. Um, you would be fine if you did well in this class. But it does sort of make me a slave to the book, which I don't entirely like. And so this week I'm breaking out of that mold, and you're reading something that I wrote, and you can see what it would be like if the whole class was like this. And then maybe you'll love the book even more. Okay, so here we go. This chapter that I wrote, it really stems out of the feeling that after teaching evolution with all the different textbooks over all the years, that there was never a treatment of macroevolution that I really loved, that I really thought, wow, students are going to like this. It matches so well with microevolution. And yet, in my mind anyway, and in the mind of some other people too, macroevolution is an analogy, pretty strict analogy, to microevolution, and the two together form this hierarchical process that explains not just the amazing adaptations of organisms, which is mainly what we've been talking about up until the first test, but also explains the diversity of life, how the tree of life is pruned and sprouts new branches, and how it comes to be shaped the way it is. So here's a little outline of my chapter. We'll start with what this grand analogy is, and then we'll begin with clade selection, kind of as we began the course with individual selection. But then, of course, there's some other things besides selection that are also part of the evolutionary process, like drift and so on. So we have to get into those. And then once we have all of the ingredients, I can go for an extended example. And the example I'm going to give is the rise and fall of selfing in flowers. So flowers that self-pollinate. They still are sexual, but they pollinate themselves. And what the dynamics of that is for the tree of life. And then there's maybe the hardest section, which is on phylogenetic conservatism. We grappled with this a little bit towards the beginning of class when we were dealing with trees, but I want to give it another try. And then after we have all those things together, I can tell you about how this goes way beyond pollination and extend the grand analogy. So I'll tip my hat to a couple of my heroes. First, George Williams, who I took a class with, and he was very instrumental in the 60s articulating how the selection that we think is responsible for adaptations, all of these wonderful, fantastic things like the nose of the elephant, or your relative hairlessness and bipedality, how all of those things we really should set as our default selection among individuals within a population. And then only in rare cases should we kind of reach for other kinds of selection, other levels of selection to explain adaptations. And then Stephen Jay Gould, who was the author of at least the words punctuated equilibrium, if not the idea. And then his magnum opus, as he was dying of cancer, was to formulate this hierarchical selection thing and articulate it in a huge book that almost no one is going to read because it's too many words. But I boiled it down to something you can read in an hour. So that's what you're going to do this weekend. Okay, so first we'll go through different forms of clade selection. I think that there's 4 ways that it can kind of show itself. And I'll start with the one that's sometimes called a key innovation. A key innovation is where you have the origin of a character, and then subsequently in the tree, that lineage comes to have lots and lots of species. So it's a new character that favors high rates of diversification. Such a character is nectar spur length. So see, these flowers have really long nectar spurs, and just the fact that they have nectar spurs allows them to diversify in the length of their nectar spurs and how wide they are, what kind of pollinators they can take advantage of. So I would say that this is a character that favors cladogenesis. It's a character that makes it so that there's a new axis along which diversity can arise. And so a fair number of you, for paper number 2, are writing about some kind of purported key innovation and whether it actually does favor cladogenesis. So that's one kind of clade selection. Moving on, here's another kind of clade selection, and that's an innovation that favors persistence, or in other words, kind of delays the expected time to extinction. And I'd give as a possible example seed dormancy. So when we have on the tree of life, when we have new lineages arise that have seeds that can last for a long, 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 long time, then I think that ought to make it so that the species or larger entities that possess those dormant seeds ought to be less likely to go extinct. Because the seeds would get stashed in various places, like seeds always do, and then yes, the environment might change so that the plant can no longer live there. But then it might change back. And so then those seeds could come out of dormancy and have not really gone to extirpation. If we then scale that up to not just a local place, but the larger geographic range, then I would think that seed dormancy would be a character or an innovation that would favor persistence and prevent extinction. Now notice that whether we're talking about nectar spurs or seed dormancy, the formation of the character is by the old way that we've always been talking about, the ordinary selection among individuals within a population, where some individuals do better than other individuals in pretty immediate way, like in the next few generations, making it so that their offspring are more numerous than the offspring of other plants that didn't have extended seed dormancy. But these characters have consequences in the long term as the tree of life continues on. As history continues to unfurl, it makes it so that as a consequence of having this adaptation, not the reason for the adaptation, but as a consequence of it, those lineages are, at least in my mind, more likely to survive than other lineages whose seeds die after a couple of years. Okay, number 3 would be an innovation that disfavors cladogenesis. So the other 2 are kind of like positive selection, and this is like a negative selection thing, where you get a new character that arises, and it might arise over and over again in the tree of life, and then that new character tends to make it so that the lineage that possesses it is not likely to turn into a whole bunch of species. And as a possible example, I would give abiotic pollination. In other words, pollination by wind or water And it turns out that most of flowering plants are biotically pollinated, and they kind of started out that way, pollinated by insects and other animals. And they have pretty high rates of cladogenesis. But then, when on that tree of life you have the origination of wind pollination, most of the time, cladogenesis kind of shuts down. Like here's a thalictrum in the buttercup family, and there's not that many species of thalictrums. They're wind pollinated compared to buttercups. There's lots and lots of species of buttercups. Now, the one huge exception to this is grasses. Grasses, there's of course tons of species of. But I would argue that the reason why grasses are so diverse is because the long-term trend for a while has been that the continents have become more dry, especially interiorly. And grasses have a great leg up in these dry interior places. And so grasses have been doing great, but it's not because they're wind pollinated. It's because of other features that have to do with changing climates. And so, yes, they have diversified a lot, but it's not their wind pollination. Whereas lots of other little branches on the tree of life are wind pollinated, and they haven't turned into anything special or remarkable. Okay, and then, as you might have guessed, the fourth kind of clade selection is innovation that disfavors persistence. So it's sort of like adaptations that in the short run are great. They're great for the individual, and so they spread throughout the population, and species come to be characterized in that way, but they're suicide for the clade. Like eventually, they cause them to go extinct. And so a possible explanation, a possible example of this would be the evolution of separate sexes in flowers, which is called dioecious. So most of our flowers are hermaphroditic, but then over and over in the tree of life, you get the evolution of separate sexes, of dioecious species. But these are mainly little twigs on the tree of life, and I think they're little twigs because they just keep on going extinct. They go extinct for all sorts of reasons. One reason is just that when they go through population fluctuations, it's not too unlikely that you'll end up with a patch of flowers that are all one sex. And then they die. All right, now all of these forms of clade selection are ways in which a feature that is more or less constant throughout a clade then affects its probability of going extinct or changing into a lot more species. But there are other things that can also affect the radiation of a group of organisms, things that don't have to do with the characteristics of the organism itself. And so we should bring those in as well. And you might think of those as less deterministic. You know, they're not part of the organism, and so they might be more like chance. So let's go on for some other macroevolutionary ingredients. And the first one I would think that we should bring up is clade drift. So just as with microevolution, we had the possibility that an organism might have a feature because of either adaptation or because of drift. So too with at the clade level, you have the possibility that a clade might do well because of its features, or its features might not be the reason why it does well, but those features, of course, then spread with it because they're kind of part of it. So, for instance, you might know that flowers often have 5 parts around here. There's a lot of species that have 5 parts, like 5 petals. And then there's some that have 4, and then you might know that like the monocots tend to have 3. But that number, like the ratios of 5 to 4 to 3, in our flora is different than the ratio would be in, say, the Australian flora. And I think it's quite possible that that has nothing to do with 5 being good and 4 being bad. Like, you know, they all work great. It's just that there are some lineages, some clades that had 5 and they did well in our flora, and there are other lineages that had 4 and they did well in a different flora. Similarly, we can think about like founder effects. When the Hawaiian Islands first came out of the ocean, then a relatively small number of plants made it there. I think it's just like 270 or something like that. And then those plants burst into a lot of species. In other words, a lot of them underwent radiations on the Hawaiian Islands. And it might well not have anything to do with their features. So it's not because of clade selection that you had higher rates of cladogenesis. It's just because those are the plants that happen to get there. Some tarweeds happen to get to Hawaii, some lobelias happen to get to Hawaii. They turned into a whole bunch of species. But if it hadn't been tarweeds, it might have been, you know, some other thing like, you know, sunflowers or something like that. And that would have turned into a whole bunch of species. Okay, then along with drift, we could also have hitchhiking. Hitchhiking would be where you do have some character that's responsible for a clade being diverse, but it's not the character you're thinking about. So for instance, orchids, huge diverse group, right? It might be the most diverse family of flowering plants if it's not for sunflowers and their kin. And orchids have inferior ovaries. That is, the ovary looks like it's below the flower. Anatomically, it's not, but it kind of looks like it is. It could well be, though, that having an inferior ovary has nothing to do with the success of orchids. It's just something that arose in the lineage of orchids, and then some other things arose in the same lineage, that lineage that led up to the burst of orchids, which includes having bilaterally symmetrical flowers and tiny little seeds and a dependence on a certain kind of mycorrhizal relationship with fungi and so on. And that those other traits are the things that are responsible for the diversification of orchids. Those other traits are the ones that cause them to have higher rates of cladogenesis and perhaps not terrible rates of persistence. And that inferior ovaries just sort of hitchhiked along for the ride. Okay, those things were a little bit whimsical, but now I want to talk about something that I think is a little more you can sink your teeth into, and that is transitional bias. So when I was talking about alleles, an evolutionary process just with alleles, I talked a lot about mutations, right? So mutations are these things that happen, and occasionally they're good, and you know the whole story with that. But a lot of times they're bad. Bad alleles arise through mutation. And then those bad alleles are eventually eliminated by selection, but in the meantime, all of us are carrying around a genetic load. And so when we think about mutations, then we often recognize that there's a bias between going from allelic state that's working to one that's not working, that is a high rate of that direction, and a kind of low rate going the opposite direction, where you have an allele that doesn't work, it's terrible, it's non-functional, and then there's mutations that restore its function. that would be a mutational bias. And we could just sort of generalize and call that mutational bias a transitional bias. So for instance, when we were thinking about flower color in larkspurs, I said larkspurs are generally purple, but the biochemical pathway that makes that pigment, that purple pigment, that can mutate and it can make the larkspur white. The white larkspurs are not pollinated as well, so there's selection against them. And in a population of larkspurs, you'll find some proportion of them that are white, and that's due to a balance between mutation and selection, a selection-mutation equilibrium. Okay, now similarly at the clade level, we can also think about transitional bias. We can even use the same example, flower color. So for vast reaches of plants, they have this biochemical pathway that allows them to make floral pigments that are kind of blue-violet. They could be more bluish or more violet or more pinkish depending on the pH. But anyway, there's a set biochemical pathway that makes that almost all flowering plants had at some point in their evolutionary history. And then, in various lineages, there's been either drift or adaptive change that has caused particular sublineages to have one color or another. Like they've gone over to hummingbird pollination and they've become red, or they've gone over to nighttime pollination by moths and they become white, and so on. So there you can have what's a transition, right? It's more than just a mutation, and it's adaptive. It happens in a lineage. It comes to characterize species in higher groups. We might even think of them, if there's situations where there's punctuated equilibrium, we might think of them as representing the punctuation, where you had an adaptive shift over to a new pollinator, and that pollinator selected for a new flower color, and the new flower color spread throughout that lineage, and that became an established species. So what transitional bias would be is if there's more transitions from one color, say this blue-violet that everything started with, to other colors like yellow and red and orange and white, and there's almost never a reversal back to blue. And I think that that's kind of the case in penstemons. Like in penstemons, we have all of these species that start out kind of bluish, and they're bee-pollinated. And then in 20-something cases, we have the origination of hummingbird pollination, and the flowers kind of go over towards being red. There's more transitions from blue to red than there is from red to blue. In fact, we think there's 0 transitions from red to blue. Okay, so that's another evolutionary ingredient that's kind of like mutation. Now I can take up an extended example, and this extended example has to do with selfing, self-pollination. And again, self-pollination, it's not asexual pollination. It's just when the flowers make both pollen and ovules, and then the pollen pollinates the stigma on the same plant. And so the offspring have the same mother as they have a father in hermaphroditic flowers. Of course, it only happens in hermaphroditic flowers. And when this happens, the anthers and stigmas, they evolve to be at the same height, right next to one another, and they evolve to mature at the same time. Whereas in just sort of your ordinary outcrossing plant, often the anthers and stigmas are spatially separated, and they're also often temporally separated. So they won't mature at the same moment, and they'll also, like the stigma will stick out in front of the anthers, which prevents self-pollination. But when you have the evolution of self-pollination, the adaptive evolution through ordinary selection that happens among individuals within a population, then one of the characters that changes with the evolution of selfing is that the anthers and stigmas come to be right next to each other and mature at the same time. They mature at the same moment. They have no positional separation. They also come to be self-compatible. So kind of your basic situation for most outcrossing plants is that at least partially they're self-incompatible. If you put pollen of the same plant on the stigmas of that plant, then there's a reaction between the pollen grains that are growing, pollen tubes, and the stylar tissue, and it causes the pollen tubes to not grow all the way down. So that's true of lots and lots of outcrossing plants. And then self-compatibility has arisen from that many, many times, both in ones that are pretty strongly selfing and then also ones that are outcrossing but self occasionally. And then ones that in lineages or species or populations that have taken up selfing, then the nectar evolves to almost nothing. So nectar is costly, and if the plants are already reproducing by selfing, then, and that's sort of the habit that they've taken up, then of course there's selection to reduce the costs, and that means minimizing the amount of nectar that's produced. The petals come to be diminutive, and in general the flowers are not as showy. They're just little teeny flowers. The amount of pollen that's produced in the anthers declines. If the plant is selfing all the time, it only needs a little teeny bit of pollen. It doesn't need to put out, tens of thousands of grains of pollen onto the backs of bees. And here's a whole bunch of examples from the California flora, where you start out with flowers that are like this, that are outcrossing, and they're big and showy, and they have nectar, and then you have the evolution of a new species or subspecies or something like that that has tiny little flowers and produces almost no nectar. Here's a monkey flower, and then it evolved into this monkey flower. And here is a lotus, and it's a cousin of this tiny little lotus. And probably the evolution of selfing in the California flora is so strong because we have such a terrible summer. That is, the plants have to get from wherever, especially if they're annuals, they have to germinate in a couple of weeks, and they have to set seed by June, because there's not going to be any rain after June, which is a very short period of time, and selfing in general takes less time than outcrossing. So you can easily understand how, as the climate became more and more Mediterranean, with a longer and more terrible summer drought, then in lineage after lineage, there was selection, adaptive selection, the old ordinary types of thing that we've been talking about since the beginning of class for the evolution of selfing. Now, selfing comes with some bad things too. In particularly, selfing, of course, increases inbreeding depression. So if the lineage for time out of mind has been outcrossing, then it would have built up a genetic load, just like the genetic load that's built up in you. I don't mean you individually, but in, the population of people that you belong to. And of course, when you mate with close relatives, then you produce these offspring that have hemophilia and all sorts of other bad things. And similarly, when these flowers mate with themselves, then they produce offspring that are more homozygous. And of course, they're also more homozygous for deleterious recessive alleles. And so that causes inbreeding depression, or that is inbreeding depression. And there would have been lots and lots of inbreeding depression as these outcrossing species were transitioning to selfing species. Now, the selfing species are habitual selfers. That doesn't mean that they can't outcross. Like you can take pollen from them and move it to a different plant, and you can make seeds. So they can, generally speaking, can outcross. They just don't have any mechanisms for outcrossing, and selfing happens really fast, so they become habitual selfers. What would have happened during this transition is they would have become selfing more and more, right? And that would have revealed these deleterious recessive alleles. Then natural selection, the ordinary type of natural selection, would have removed the deleterious alleles from the population. There would have been more selection against deleterious alleles in the selfing population than there had been in the outcrossing population. And so at some point, then they have much less inbreeding depression, right? There's less and less inbreeding depression because the inbreeding depression is caused by the deleterious alleles. The deleterious alleles are being removed from the population. So if this goes on for 100 generations or something, then they might still have a little bit of inbreeding depression, but it would be much less than the first generation after eons of outcrossing. And so you kind of get a bifurcation in stable states, where on the one hand, there's organisms that are mostly outcrossers and might do a little bit of selfing, and then on the other hand, there's ones that have gotten through this valley of death and entered a new adaptive peak where selfing is not so bad. Now, those are all sort of short-term reasons why selfing, might spread. We're talking about a few generations here, where each generation it's better to self than it is to outcross for various reasons, and it becomes less and less costly to self, and that's all on a per generation basis. I mean, okay, you could argue maybe it's 3 generations, but we're not talking about, gazillion generations here. On the other hand, over the long term, selfing could be really bad. And it could be really bad for a couple of reasons. One possibility is that there's kind of in selfing species, ones that just have absolutely no outcrossing, there's the potential for a genetic meltdown. Like they still have great big genomes, just like they had when they were outcrossers. And these great big genomes are constantly undergoing mutation. They might also live in kind of smallest populations because, after all, they're flowers, and they're not interbreeding with one another. So I'm not exactly sure what a population is, but there's little patches of flowers here, there, and yonder, and those patches of flowers are all really close relatives of one another. And so, as you go on for thousands of generations, more and more mutations build up, and sometimes those mutations kind of get fixed because the little local population will just thrive temporarily for whatever reason, even though it has a deleterious mutation in it, and then the good times change to bad times, and they just end up with more and more mutations. So it could be that there's this mutational meltdown that over time eventually makes it so that selfing species just go extinct. Another possibility is that selfing species have a much reduced ability to adapt compared to outcrossing species. So outcrossing species, they are constantly having sex with other organisms. What that means is that when a good beneficial mutation arises in this plant, and then another different good beneficial mutation at a different locus arises in another plant, then eventually those two beneficial mutations can get together in the same plant. Whereas as long as these guys are selfing, if you have a good beneficial mutation in this organism and you have another one in that, then it's very, very hard to get them together as long as they're selfing, because they don't have any descendants that ever combine with one another. And so it could be that for selfing species, as time goes on and the environments change, they kind of have a reduced ability to adapt to new situations. And so eventually they go extinct. Okay, so what I've sort of outlined here is a biology that involves two levels of in the evolutionary hierarchy. On the one hand, there's these adaptive transitions towards selfing, and that's a transitional bias. And then on the other hand, there's clade selection against the selfing clades. So we have this transitional drive from outcrossing to selfing. That would mean that if we sort of survey the tree of life, there's lots and lots and lots of times when you have the evolution of a selfing lineage from an outcrossing lineage, but very few times when you have the evolution of a outcrossing lineage from a selfing lineage. Like none of those arguments that I gave for the evolution of selfing, none of them work in reverse, except for maybe if you had the season change from being a long drought to having no drought, okay, then maybe that would work in reverse. But all those business about purging deleterious alleles and efficiency and stuff like that, that only works in one direction. And then secondly, we have clade selection against selfing lineages. So don't you see, this is a dynamic that has a very, very tight analogy to the origin of new deleterious mutations and then selection against those deleterious mutations. Like I used the same reasoning that I used when I was talking about mutation selection balance. It's just that now I'm not talking about the origin of new alleles and their elimination. I'm talking about the origin of new species and things like species and their elimination. And not only that, this transitional drive, the thing that corresponds to mutation at the lower level, that is innovation at the level of clades on a tree, twigs on the tree of life, it is itself caused by natural selection adapting things at the lower level. So it's like the lower level stuff is bubbling up, causing the higher level dynamic. It's the action of things like punctuated equilibrium that are making new species that allows species to be sorted. And species sorting is, or it's the essential part of clade selection. Now, some other people have other words for some of this, like the book calls clade selection species selection. I find that if you end up calling clade selection species selection, then it's not very long before it becomes counterintuitive. And so that's why I've chosen to call it clade selection. Also, the book really emphasizes extinction, whereas I emphasize persistence. And they're just reverses of one another. Persistence is the good thing. Extinction is the bad thing if you're the one that's going extinct. But in order to make the language more parallel and to make the analogy obvious, I kind of had to rearrange the words just a little teeny bit. All right, so here's a little cartoon, and we have a tree here, and then over and over again, see, it's kind of Halloween colors, orange and black, right? Over and over, you get the origin of selfing from outcrossing, But most of these are twigs that are very shallow on the tree. They quickly go extinct. And if you go around looking at selfing species in the flora, what you find is that they are mostly very closely related to outcrossing species. Now, you don't find like whole genera of plants that are selfers. You find a whole genus of plants that's mostly outcrossers and has one or two selfers in it. And then you have another whole genus of plants that's mostly outcrossers, has one or two selfers in it, and so on and so forth. And that's really what suggested this dynamic to begin with. It's far from proven. It's difficult to prove these things. But I think that this is a very likely case of clade selection and transitional drive. Okay, now I've been kind of putting this off, but I think we need to embrace phylogenetic conservatism, which I think is a lot like heritability. So there's some terminology here. First, we talked last time about stasis, which is the part of punctuated equilibrium that's the equilibrium part. Stasis, that's when there's hardly any change for a long period of time in a species. And that's conservatism at the species level. And then phylogenetic conservatism is usually talking about when, despite the fact that you've had phylogenetic cladogenesis, despite the fact that one lineage is turned into two or more lineages, nevertheless, the members of those two lineages still share a lot of things in common. So we and bonobos have definitely turned into two lineages. Nevertheless, if you go and study the physiology of bonobos and the physiology of humans, it's very, very similar. And it's not just really closely related species that this is true of either. It's also true that you can have vast reaches of organisms that are kind of similar to one another. In fact, more or less all placental mammals kind of basically have the same physiology. That's why we can go and study what's happening in lab mice and then use that information as medically relevant information on humans. Because really, a lab mouse and a human share an awful lot of things in common in terms of their physiology. In fact, we might say that the tree of life is littered with innovations that have then become features of conservatism. When they formed, they were not static. When they formed, they were evolutionarily labile. That's how they became innovations. But then some subset of those innovations got locked in place and then characterized the whole rest of the clade. They became synapomorphies, really synapomorphies you could really hang your hat on. If we just think about multicellular animals, then first the body plans formed, right? Those are the phyla. And back in the day, those body plans were very chaotic, but then they were consolidated into a few different body plans of the different phyla. And then if we just take the arthropods, then within the insects, you get the different orders of insects. And they all, some of them have two wings that they flap with, and then some of them, one of the pairs of wings has become hardened, or one of them pairs of wings has become halteres, or stuff like that. And those characteristics of the orders have gotten kind of locked in place. And those are subsidiary features of the body plan of the organism. So first you had whether they were coelomates or not, and whether they were deuterostomes or protostomes, and then you had how their wings got hardened or were used, whether they had sucking mouth parts or chewing mouth parts. at the ordinal level. Then, of course, within any one order, like within the order of true flies, you get different families of flies, and those different families of flies, they also have a bunch of characteristics that make them families. And then within a family, you have a bunch of genera, and within genera, you have a bunch of species. So there's a tremendous amount of phylogenetic conservatism that seems to have arisen. The reason that there is phylogenetic conservatism is a little bit obscure. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but it might have something to do with something called burden. And I'll get that into that, what I mean by that in a minute. But anyway, it's the kind of locking in place of something that was an innovation, and then it became crucial for the life of the organism. So now whenever there's a mutation that upsets that arrangement, it's selected against. There's stabilizing selection to maintain it. So stasis at the species level, or conservatism more generally, it's the reason that taxa are known to taxonomists. It's the reason why taxonomists can characterize families and orders and classes and so on. Here's an example. These are Ceropegias. And Ceropegias, the way that they work is they have this kind of flask-shaped thing. And inside of the flask, here's one that's torn open. There's the primary sexual parts are here. And there's some kind of downwardly pointing hairs and some smelly stuff in here. And so what happens is that flies, which are attracted to smelly things, they find this flask and they crawl down deep inside of it. And they wander around there for a while. They may try to lay eggs in the flask, which of course is futile because those maggots will never develop into flies. But the flies are dupes, right? They're just fooled into thinking that this smelly thing might be some rotting something or other that they can lay their eggs on. Anyway, eventually, if the plant is lucky, the fly gets its foot caught in one of these little slits down here. You can't see the slits, but they're there. And will then pull out a pollen sac. And it'll be caught on its leg. And the pollen sac will dry in such a way that it's very hard to get off of the fly's leg. Eventually, the fly is released and comes out of the flask. And if it's dumb enough, it does the whole thing over again. And that's how pollination occurs in Ceropegia. So these flask-shaped things, they arose once upon a time, and then Ceropegias turned into 100 and something species, a whole bunch of different species. Lots and lots of species. And the species differ from one another, but they don't really differ in having this flask. They differ in how narrow the flask's tube is, and the colors, and the shapes, and what kind of smelly thing that they make, and stuff like that. Those are characters that are subsidiary to the architecture of the flower. And actually, these flowers, they belong to the same group as milkweeds, and that business of having 5 slits where there's a pollen sac that dries onto it, that's a character that belongs to a larger group than just the Ceropegias. So there's conservatism within conservatism for these flowers. And of course, there's also a delightful amount of lability that makes it so all the different flowers all the different species have their own little peculiarities. And those things maybe would always stay labile and maybe would never really be unburdened. So conservatism is like heritability. It's sort of an extra level of heritability that comes beyond just the normal heritability. And it makes it so that on the tree of life, there are different clades that are characterized in one or another ways. And that then provides the criterion for clade selection. Clade selection can really get a grasp on things when the clades themselves are characterizable, when they are conservative, when they are fixed. Take the situation of having no nectar at all. Like when something evolves to have no nectar at all versus having nectar, and that might well be a very, very conservative feature. Like they can't reinvent nectar. Then having no nectar at all versus having nectar would become the criterion of clade selection that would sort species out, and it might cause the ones that have no nectar at all to be more likely to go extinct than the ones that have nectar. Because the ones that have nectar can appeal to all sorts of different pollinators, whereas the ones that have specialized on having no nectar at all, they can only appeal to the pollinators that can be fooled into doing stuff without getting a reward. And that's rather different than a character that is not very conservative. A not very conservative character would probably be the amount of nectar that's produced, because then you can have kind of regular, old, ordinary natural selection that's increasing and decreasing the amount of nectar that's produced depending on what the pollinators are that generation or that set of generations. And that's the case, then that tends to give selection at a lower level more strength or more effectiveness, more of a response to selection than if things are locked down between different clades, where then selection at a higher level comes to be more important. Okay, there's this guy named Rupert Riedel, and I guess he's must be dead by now. If he's not dead, he must be 100 years old. Because he was kind of old. This is a picture that was taken about 1970, I think. He's the guy that came up with this burden terminology. He said that the characters of taxonomic groups that are conserved, those ones that are conserved, are traits that have become burdened. And what that means is that other traits, other functional parts of the organism have been built upon them and have made them more centrally connected in the development and function of the organism. So what we're talking about here is that when you had flowers that, say, evolved a certain kind of pigment production, that pigment production wasn't only used in the flowers, it also is caused by the expression of genes that are in a biochemical pathway, and that same biochemical pathway is perhaps used in the defense of the plants, the chemical defense of the plants. And so if the plants lost that biochemical pathway, they would be defenseless and they would get eaten up by herbivores. And so that's why floral characters, floral color characters come to be more stable. That just might be, though, a tiny little bit of it. It could be that the way that flowers are formed in, say, having sepals on the outside in a whorl, and then petals on the inside, and anthers on the inside of that, and then carpels on the inside of that. What if those same genes have something to do with photosynthesis? They've come to have something to do with photosynthesis. If that's the case, then a plant that has sort of a rearrangement of its flower parts, which happens all the time in the lab, like when you shoot X-rays at them, you can get plants to come up with all sorts of crazy mutations. But maybe it doesn't affect just the flowers, it actually affects their ability to photosynthesize. So they really are hopeless monsters. Just organisms that can never live. And so they're quickly eliminated from the tree of life without ever going anywhere. They're quickly eliminated from the population without ever going anywhere. And so Rupert Riedel, he was really interested in systems theory, like how a bunch of interconnected nodes of genes could have effects on different things and blah, blah, blah. So you think lots and lots of epistasis, lots and lots of pleiotropy, all sorts of crazy stuff going on inside of the organism that you don't really see. It could be responsible for the conservatism that's found. And he was emphasizing how the evolution that does occur happens as these subsidiary parts of the architecture that has gotten locked in place. And that's why we can see this the hierarchy in the taxonomic tree of life as opposed to the hierarchy in evolution. Now, another cool thing about Rupert Riedel's writings is that he went from this kind of view to emphasizing how the capacity to adapt, the ability to adapt, it itself changes in different lineages. So there are some lineages that are very able to adapt, and then there are other lineages that are kind of not that good at evolution. And it's because of their characteristics. So I would then extend that statement to all the other evolutionary ingredients. So this says the evolution of evolutionary ingredients. Riedel and Gould and all those guys, they emphasize the capacity to adapt evolves. I would say, so do other evolutionary ingredients, like the capacity to specialize evolves. In some groups of insects, they have a great capacity to specialize on one kind of host plant or another, whereas in other groups of insects, they don't tend to specialize. Grasshoppers don't specialize very much. The family Chrysomelidae within the beetles specializes a lot. Different major clades on the tree of life have different capacities to speciate. Like mosses, speciation not so great. Whereas flowering plants, speciation enormous. They have different capacities to expand geographically, to persist, and then to undergo subsequent cladogenesis. Notice that all of these things that I'm talking about here have to do with aspects of macroevolution. So again, I think that there's this hierarchy where there's a lot of what I've been calling microevolution that's responsible for the adaptations of organisms, how they accumulate over the eons more and more great alleles that all work well together and cause us to have super duper adaptive features. But that's not the only thing there is to pay attention to about evolutionary biology. It's also kind of interesting that there are hundreds of thousands of beetles, and there's only one ginkgo biloba. Even though they both are lineages that are about the same age. And, we could have had lots and lots of ginkgo species, and we don't. So I'm focusing on explanations for high species richness. And these explanations for high species richness are kind of analogous to the explanations for adaptations. The explanations for adaptations included a long and winding road of the accumulation of alleles that were beneficial in a series of different environments that the organism has lived in from way, way back. Back when you were fishes, you got a whole bunch of great adaptations to being fishes, and you still carry with you a lot of those adaptations to being fishes. And then when you climbed out on land, you got some other adaptations, and then when you became an amniote, you got some other adaptations, and then When you became a placental mammal, you got a bunch of other adaptations. And when you became a primate, you became a bunch of other adaptations. There was a long and winding road that led up to all those adaptations that you have as an organism. And some of them we would call exaptations, because they've changed function and blah, blah, blah. Similarly, in some group of organisms that's very species rich, there's a long and winding road of features that led up to it becoming able to be species rich. And if we really want to go out on a limb, we could call some of them innovations, kind of like we call things adaptations, and then we would call other things exovations, like we call other things exaptations. You can read about it. Okay, so I would then sketch out this process of macroevolution as being pretty strictly analogous to the process of microevolution. More incipient clades are produced than can possibly survive. In other words, more species are produced than possibly can survive. But I don't want to just focus on the species level. It could be any level. It could be populations. It could be genera, whatever. To some extent, differences between clades affect the rates of cladogenesis and persistence. This is the component of the process that we call clade selection. To some extent, clade differences become conservative. That's heritability. Thus, there ensues a struggle for existence among the clades. Now, it's true this struggle for existence is a little bit different than the struggle for existence among individuals within a population. For instance, the clades we're talking about might not be face-to-face. They might be scattered all over the globe, and they're each playing against the house rather than playing against one another in the game of life. But nevertheless, some of them will fail and some of them will not, and it's partially determined by the features that they have. And so, over time, there should accumulate in highly successful groups. In highly successful groups, they have accumulated a whole bunch of things that make them successful, that make them not so prone to extinction and prone to making more subsidiary species. So there's an accumulation of traits that make clades successful in this macroevolutionary sense. And this macroevolutionary sense means that they have broad geographic ranges. They are often divided into lots of subclades, so they make up lots of species. They live for a long time, they persist for a long time, and resist extinction, and so on and so forth. Now, I don't expect people or want people to swallow this analogy as being absolutely the same as what happens among individuals. There are some reasons for thinking that the weight of the different processes would be different at the higher and lower level. And then maybe the thing that I want you most to remember about it is that I generally think that selection among individuals is mainly responsible for adaptations of organisms, how long our teeth are, and how long our necks are, and how many fingers we have, and stuff like that. And then selection among clades is mainly responsible for the diversity on the tree of life. So they kind of address different aspects of life as we know it. Let's see. Okay, now I had to write this chapter because I'm a pollination biologist and they invited me to write it for a pollination book. But I think considering pollination, as helpful as it is, it leads to a consideration of everything else. So first, it leads to consideration of seed dispersal. And there's a way in which seed dispersal is different than pollination. It could be that pollination is really responsible for lots and lots of initial divergences in lineages. It makes things a lot different from one another, kind of like sexual selection makes things a lot different from one another too. And seed dispersal, not so much. That kind of initial kind of cutting edge of divergence business with seed dispersal, not so much. Nevertheless, seed dispersal can become really, really important as a key innovation. So for instance, plants that have these little reward bodies on their seeds that attract ants, those belong to clades that are much more species rich than sister clades that don't have any special encouragement for ant dispersal. So ant dispersed seeds seems to be an important thing. We might even sort of go beyond just seeds and think about spore dispersal versus the types of dispersal that happens in angiosperms or even in conifers. Ferns and mosses tend to have huge geographic ranges with not so many species. So they become successful in one way, and then they are less successful in another way compared to flowering plants, which tend to have small geographic ranges on a per species basis. Like each species has a smaller geographic range, although the larger groups may have large geographic ranges. Now, seed dispersal is just one thing. All this whole consideration also leads me to consider life history traits. And we've been studying these succulents that grow right around here. There's a whole bunch of species. And it turns out that the geographic range size is a correlate of life history evolution. When you have a species that's specialized to rush to reproduction, it usually has a small body size and it's easily dried out. And those species are kind of restricted to nice little places along the coast. Whereas the species that have broad geographic ranges, like Dudleya lanceolata, they are ones that delay reproduction and build up their body size, kind of get strong before they reproduce. I also think that it sort of applies to things that are overtly about niches. So it turns out, we did this little study in Bishop Creek watershed of Sierra Nevada, and we found that species that live in wet places, they tend to have broad geographic ranges, whereas the species that are endemics and have evolved right there in just that one place, those things live in pretty dry places, dry, rocky places. And it could well be that kind of the cradle of diversity is right where you have an intermediate level of physical stress in the environment, where it's not terrible like a desert, but it's also not luscious like right along the coast or something. That it's right at that kind of ecotonal place where the whole vegetation changes all the time, that's where there's new species are arising all the time. I'd even say that the system of chromosomal recognition could affect the speciation rates. So in ferns, the first thing to diverge is chromosomal recognition at meiosis. Two lineages that you can barely tell apart have probably evolved differences in their chromosomes. And because of that, when they come together at meiosis, they are largely sterile. In other words, chromosomal changes right at the cutting edge of speciation in ferns, and then that leads to all this polyploid evolution that I was talking about last time. Okay, so here is a cartoon of the tree of life, and here's what I'm suggesting. that on this tree of life you have deep, deep roots. And at the tips there's things that might correspond to genera. And they have different numbers of species in them. Like this one only has 2 species in it, and this one has 6 species in it. And that is partially because of their traits. And those traits are scattered on the long lineage that goes way back in their life. So where bilateral symmetry in the flowers arises, the propensity to diversify increases a little bit. Where seed size increases, diversification decreases a little bit. The arrow goes down a little bit. Where there's shift to dry habitats as opposed to really wet ones, diversification increases a little bit. And so the reason why you have lots of species here is partially because if you trace it back far enough, you find that it has all of those ducks in a row that make for a high speciation rate, or a high diversification rate and a low extinction rate. Long persistence and lots of cladogenesis. And then there are other groups, not so much so. There's also a trade-off, at least potentially, between the different components of success. So it could be that by evolving characters that have the consequence of making for lots of cladogenesis, it also makes for not such great persistence. So there's a negative effect and a positive effect. All right, so let's sort of conclude here. First, I think there's this grand analogy that I really love. It, of course, needs refinement. You know, like the whole history of evolutionary biology is just people arguing with each other about how to state things in a way that's, you know, really what you mean, really accurate. And so, yeah, this one's going to need some refinement too. And this grand analogy, although it's been mentioned several times in past decades, I don't think it was very well articulated until we get to, you know, Gould around 2000, which in my time is not very long ago. But I think it's still time to teach it. And that's why I'm overwriting the book this week and making you read my stuff. One of the reasons why I think it's helpful to teach it is because it clarifies our understanding of the whole evolutionary dynamic. Like, it makes us think in an abstract way, which as hard as that is, I think it's super worthwhile. It is, in its essence, it's hierarchical. Like, you have to understand that it's adaptations at one level feeding into selection at another level. Like if you miss that, if you miss the fact that there's 2 levels here that feed into one another, that affect one another, then you're missing, you know, kind of my whole spiel. I also think that by taking this view, it guides research and it leads to a kind of conceptual unification that really makes for the study of biological diversity as a more interesting topic. It's not just a topic that's for moldy old museum types who want to memorize innumerable species names. Like the study of diversity itself is something that could be studied kind of from a process-oriented point of view. It also leads us away from being these people that are just obsessed with adaptation. Like, okay, I get it. Adaptation's cool. We spent half the class on it. You know, I'm not denying that, but I don't think adaptation is the only thing about organisms that we want to pay attention to. And that's why your first paper was about adaptation, but your second paper is about diversification. And really, I guess my message here is that there are cool processes that are analogous to the ones we already considered that trim the tree of life and allow it to sprout new branches in opportune ways.